Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Prisoners Advice Service Toolkits presentation. Before we launch into the program, I have a few housekeeping items to address. We encourage you to submit questions to our speakers at any time during the program using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will address questions throughout the webinar and at the end of the program as time permits. If we cannot get to all the questions in the allotted time, one of our speakers will follow up with you post-event. If you have any technical issues during the webinar, please reach out to us using the same Q&A feature and we will respond as quickly as possible. With housekeeping matters behind us, I will now turn it over to Lubia from the Prisoners Advice Service. Lubia?
Thank you, Ashley. Good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Lubia Begum-Robb and I'm the Director of the Prisoners Advice Service. For those of you who don't know us, I'm going to tell you very quickly a tiny little bit about us. We're a small organisation employing 6 part-time legal caseworkers, 2 fundraisers and an office manager, and we give prisoners legal advice, information and representation about the application of the prison rules. Ordinarily, we would run outreach advice sessions in clinics, but that stopped in March. We have a letters clinic, we do casework, and of course we have the advice line that's open 4 days a week. Every year we try to have 2 public events, but that of course has gone a bit awry this year. In November we have an annual lecture, but we thought it would make sense to combine the launch of our newest set of toolkits with a panel discussion around the rights of particular groups of prisoners. So thanks to the very generous support of the Tudor Trust and the Cottingham Trust, we've produced 2 new toolkits for prisoners who identify as LGBT and those who identify as trans. We hope that these will give prisoners practical knowledge and information about prison rules and procedures. This webinar is a first for us and it's been made possible thanks to Cooley LLP. My thanks in advance to the panel and especially to Deborah Russo, who is going to chair this evening. Deborah was my job share for 5 glorious years as co-director before she moved to Scotland. Once you work for PAS, you sort of never leave, whilst she's studying for her PhD. Deborah will also then show you the front covers of our toolkits because they've exceeded our expectations and our usual standards. So I hope you find the evening interesting. I'm going to hand you over to Deborah. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Lubia. So I'm very honoured to be chairing the launch of the Trans and LGBT Prisoners Toolkits tonight. Yet another PAS success out of so many. Here they are, and many more to come, no doubt. PAS remains a lifeline for so many prisoners, especially so in such troubling and difficult times in the midst of a global pandemic. By targeting the needs of trans and LGBT prisoners, PAS has shown yet again to be tackling the needs of the most vulnerable within one of the most marginalised groups. I will now go on to presenting our speakers for tonight. Each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes, followed by questions. After the speakers have finished, please feel free to ask, or throughout the webinar, please feel free to ask questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We will be monitoring the Q&A and we'll aim to answer all questions. But as we will only have about 20 minutes for questions, we may have to resort to answering some via message. So our speakers tonight are Sarah Lamble, who's our first speaker. Sarah is a founding member of the Bent Bars Project, which coordinates a letter writing program for LGBTQ+ prisoners in Britain. Sarah is also a reader in Criminology and Queer Theory at Birkbeck at the University of London. Sarah was one of the advisors for the toolkits. We then have Stuart Withers. Stuart Withers is a barrister at No. 5 Chambers, where he practices in prison law, actions against the police and inquests. He is the author of the toolkits. Thank you, Stuart, for your wonderful work on this. We then have Dean Kingham. Dean is a solicitor at Swain and Co and a committee member for the Association of Prison Lawyers. He specialises in representing prisoners and has represented a number of transgender prisoners before the Parole Board and before the case boards. So without further ado, I will leave this virtual space to Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. It's really great to be here tonight, and I want to say a big thank you to Paz and all the organizers of this evening, and to everyone who's made the toolkits happen. And what I want to do tonight is just say a few words about how the Toolkits project arose and why it's such an important resource, particularly in the current moment. So if you aren't already familiar with the Bent Bars project, we are a grassroots mutual aid project that provides direct support and solidarity to LGBTQ+ prisoners in Britain. We've been running for nearly 12 years, and the main thing we do is a pen pal scheme to basically link queer and trans communities across prison walls. And over the course of the project, we've been contacted by more than 750 LGBTQ+ prisoners in the UK, and we also sometimes have prisoners contact us from abroad. Now, I'm sure as many people will be aware, queer, trans, and gender nonconforming people have a long history of being targeted by the criminal justice system, both in this country and around the world. And although many overtly homophobic and transphobic laws have been overturned, we still see patterns where those who face high levels of inequality, discrimination, and marginalization are disproportionately likely to end up in prison and be funneled through the criminal justice system, and that includes LGBTQ+ people. And the Bent Bars project takes the position that prisons are institutions that reinforce inequality and violence and harm, and that as a society we should be working to end our reliance on prisons as a response to social problems such as poverty, homelessness, mental ill health, and violence. And as part of that broader strategy to reduce some of the acute harms of imprisonment, we believe that it's important to provide direct support to prisoners to increase people's chances of surviving prison and of ending up back in prison. And as I'm sure people will be aware, prison is a pretty tough place for anyone to be in, but there's specific issues that LGBTQ+ people often face. Many of these issues are actually the same kinds of issues that queer and trans communities face outside of prison, but the difference is that these issues tend to be amplified in prison because the power of the prison is so controlling, but also because you have so little access to community resources and supports when you're inside. So there's a lot of different issues that we hear about regularly from prisoners, but I'll just say a bit about some of the common ones. So coming out or being out in prison it can be a really tough thing for people, feeling isolated, feeling disconnected from community. Lots of people really feel a lack of support around exploring or expressing their identity, and people are often cut off from their family and friends and community. So that can be really hard to grapple with those things within prison. Bullying, harassment, discrimination, low-level abuse, and very acute forms of violence are really difficult for people inside. Access to healthcare is a really an acute problem, particularly for trans people in trying to access gender-affirming healthcare. Sexual health is also another issue, people being denied access to sexual health advice or condoms, and being able to practice safer sex. Navigating sexual and intimate relationships within prison can be really difficult, especially because the prison often acts like these things don't happen. And so trying to navigate those issues can be quite difficult. And then people are often subject to forced segregation, the use of so-called, protective custody or vulnerable prison units. Often LGBT people are likely to end up in those units in the name of protection, but that's often, the harms of being isolated are quite acute. And self-harm and risk of death are sadly another issue that we have to be attentive to. And I just want to note in particular the kind of impact of self-inflicted injury and how widespread they are across the prison estate, and that they're particularly acute for queer and trans people. So if you look at the stats on incidents of self-harm, they're absolutely rampant. So on average, there's 5 to 6 incidents of officially reported self-harm every hour across the prison estate in England and Wales. And those are just the officially reported cases. So over the course of this hour-long seminar tonight, that would mean there would be 5 to 6 incidents of self-harm. And in the current conditions of COVID, where many prisoners are basically being held in solitary confinement because they're locked in their cells for 23 hours a day, there's strong indicators that self-harm are on the rise. And so the need for kind of support and connection to help people survive inside is really important. And so prisoners regularly get in touch with bent bars for support and advice around what they're entitled to in prison. Yet, unfortunately, there's very few UK resources that are specific to LGBTQ prisoners, and this is why the new toolkits are so important. So Bent Bars has tried to create some resources over the years, including our newsletter, which is written by and for queer and trans prisoners to share information and advice. So one of the first newsletter we did was basically about asking prisoners to share their advice about coming out in prison and their experiences of that. But we've also had newsletters talking about how to support each other to stay safe in prison. But we commonly get lots of requests for advice around legal issues and people's human rights entitlements in prison. And so almost 7 years ago, we approached Jane Ryan, who is an absolutely brilliant lawyer who's supported a lot of LGBTQ prisoners, to ask her to help us draft a very basic Know Your Rights guide for LGBT prisoners, which she did. And unfortunately, Jane isn't here tonight, but I wanted to mention this because she was really the kind of person who got the initial version off the ground. But then a lot of the policies, the prison policies changed, and the documents really needed an update and an overhaul, and they needed to be much more comprehensive. And we also really wanted to have something that would have a nice design and would be user-friendly to people in prison. So then the Prisoner Advice Service secured funding, and I think that's largely thanks to Jeff's great work, to develop both a lesbian, gay, bisexual focused toolkit and a trans focused toolkit as part of their self-help resources. And it was really great because it meant it was possible to create something much more comprehensive and well-designed. And Jane was involved in this, but she also got Stuart involved to write the toolkits, and he's done a really brilliant job. And just to say, as part of the process of designing the toolkits, we wanted to make sure that they would reflect the specific needs and requests of prisoners. So Bent Bars sent out a short survey to all of our inside members, so the prisoners on our mailing list, to ask what topics they'd like covered, what formats they think the toolkit should be in, how they thought they should be distributed, because for many LGBTQ people who are not out, even the circulation of materials about LGBT issues can be quite sensitive. So we needed to think about how are we going to distribute these resources to people. And we had a brilliant response to our survey. We sent out about 230 surveys, and we got 135 back, which is a pretty impressive response rate. And they included responses from across 45 prisons, including prisons designated for men and prisons designated for women. And then when the first draft of the two toolkits were done, we sent out those draft versions to a smaller number of prisoners who had said that they would be happy to give feedback when we had a draft. And so that feedback was also taken on board for the final versions. So we were really pleased that prisoners could be involved in the process, and we're really excited to send the toolkits out to our members. And so I will now hand it over to Stuart, who is going to talk, I think, a little bit about the contents of the toolkits.
Thanks very much, Dr. Lamble. The toolkits, if you haven't got them, look like this. But actually, if you look at Deborah's copies of them, they're shiny and they're in colour, so they're much better. I'm really, really, really proud of these toolkits. Thank you so much for the curation to Jeff, who provided a lot of substantial assistance. Oh, thank you, Deborah. Deborah's got them up and waving them in the air. Brilliant. I'd also just like to say thank you very much to the Tudor Trust and the Cottingham Trust for funding the toolkits. I was particularly touched by Lord Cashman's tweet about how his partner's legacy has contributed to these toolkits. I found that very moving. Also, thank you very much to Paz for their hard work, including Jeff, Deborah and Luga, who very patiently waited for me to draft the toolkits, as well as to Dr. Lamble, the Winder, Bent Bars Collective, Jane Ryan, and Michelle Brewer, formerly of Garden Court Chambers, who is now a judge. And thanks also for Dean for his practical knowledge and experience for coming today. So the purpose of the toolkits was really to give practical information about LGBT prisoners' rights and how they apply as they go about their daily lives. And I felt there was a specific need really to address the number of issues that arose from the bent bars with the responses to the questionnaires. It became quite clear when looking at the responses to the questionnaires that the majority of these concerns from LGBT plus prisoners were more about how do I do something, what should I do, how can I do it? So sort of the practical steps that prisoners can take. So obviously I thought it'd be very useful to have guides that put that all that information in one place, particularly as I know from personal experience, having worked in prison or for a number of years, that prisoners really do like references to prison service instructions. And it's often the case that some prisoners really do help others to let them know what their rights are. So I'm hoping that these toolkits can be relied upon and circulated, between cellmates or other friends in prison, or just if generally people want to go down to the prison library and read them, have a great time reading them, that's fine. I think for LGBT prisoners, one of the issues is that it's quite difficult for them to know what their rights are, especially as they're in the minority of the prison population. And many of them are cut off, as Dr. Lamble said, from their wider support groups. And so they don't have the same access in prison to those support groups as they would in the community. And of course, LGBT plus prisoners face a number of discrete issues which their heterosexual counterparts or cisgender counterparts do not experience or may not experience in the same way. So the emphasis of the toolkits really is firstly to promote an understanding of rights. Secondly, what prisoners can do if they feel their rights have been violated or they feel they've been mistreated. And thirdly, to give access to other organisations that might be able to assist. And I think one of the central focuses when we were writing the toolkit and collaborating together on this is that we want prison staff and prison officials to make better decisions about the LGBT plus prisoners who are in their care. So hopefully this toolkit will allow prisoners to advocate themselves, but also maybe hope to change wider culture. Fingers crossed on that one. Just talking about what's generally in these two very lovely toolkits, I won't show up my black and white versions again. In essence, they talk very generally about the rights under the Equality Act and the rights under the Human Rights Act, particularly just focusing on the Equality Act first. So under the Equality Act 2010, there are protected characteristics. Sexual orientation and gender reassignment are both protected characteristics under the Act. So therefore, a service provider, which is a prison, can't discriminate against someone, which means they can't treat them less favourably or worse because they have that protected characteristic. And briefly, when you're looking at the Human Rights Act and the articles of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is scheduled to that, primarily we're looking at Article 8, which is the right to private life, which is a very broad, wide-ranging right, which encompasses both gender identity and sexual orientation. And further, you can look in the toolkit, there's also Article 14, which is the right not to be discriminated against because of your status enjoyed in the other convention rights. So there are a number of common themes which run through the toolkits, which I just want to briefly touch upon. Obviously, for transgender prisoners, the toolkits are quite specific, and in terms of there's difficulties with, well, they face more of a hurdle in relation to decisions made about treatment and care, especially in relation to allocation, which I'll let Dean Kingham talk about because he's got fantastic practical experience of that. But generally, the issues I just want to touch upon, which are in the toolkits, are primarily issues of discrimination within prisons, the issue of sex in prisons and access to sexual health treatment, reporting hate crime and sexual abuse, sort of cell sharing, communication with other LGBT prisoners or other organisations, and the sort of steps that prisoners can take when they feel that their rights have been violated. So we know that in prison, I know from personal experience having dealing with cases, that there is a large amount of discrimination which happens in prisons. We have to be mindful that prisoners are being detained, and therefore there's a strong presumption that prison staff and officials would treat prisoners in an acceptable way. We're aware that that doesn't happen often on a daily basis. What was surprising that when we look at all of the documents and the prison service instructions and orders is that apart from some documents which regurgitate the law, most prisons are left locally to make decisions about LGBT plus prisoners. So for example, there can be really stark difference between different prisons. So some prisons have LGBT plus representatives for each wing or each spur. Some engage and celebrate in Pride and have them as whole events, and some even have Pride weeks. But some, on the other hand, some prisons don't allow that to happen at all. So there's a really discrepancy between what an LGBT plus prisoner can expect to receive from one prison to another, and that discrepancy creates an uncertainty, which is why we've set out the practical steps that LGBT plus prisoners can take when they want to face, well, when they're trying to tackle discrimination issues that arise in their particular prison. A number of issues that came up from the questionnaire were about from bars with sex and sexual health in prisons. It's surprising that there's a real lack of policy by the Secretary of State or the Ministry of Justice on how relationships are to be managed between LGBT prisoners, despite various court challenges to ensure that there is one. So the expectation from the prison service is that sexual relationships are managed through the disciplinary policy. The prison rules don't expressly prohibit sexual acts between prisoners, but it's more to do with what if you're caught in prison having sex with your cellmate or having sex with someone you have a relationship with. And I think this really leads to a real sense of uncertainty and insecurity as to how LGBT plus prisoners in relationships, how they can act. Like, you know, for example, some of the feedback we got from questionnaires is when they're asking for guidance about topics, it's like, well, will I be separated from my partner in prison? Do I have a right to be together? So it's sort of surprising that, first of all, there's generally no right to share a cell with your partner if you formed a relationship within prison, which seems to be difficult in itself. And secondly, there's no right to share a cell with someone who's LGBT plus either. There's only perhaps a right not to share a cell with someone who's a high risk to LGBT plus prisoners, because that obviously creates a dangerous situation in which, you know, the LGBT plus prisoner might be attacked or assaulted. So it's very weird that, you know, definitely shouldn't be placed in a cell with someone who's known to perpetrate attacks against LGBT plus prisoners, but, you know, generally no right to actually be with your partner in prison or another LGBT plus or prisoner or a friendly ally. So there's an issue about whether or not that's satisfactory, in my view. And we've tried to advocate in the toolkits about what can be done in relation to that. As Dr. Lamble mentioned, there is a difficulty in relation to sort of sexual health care in prison. There's no centralised policy anywhere that talks about prisoners' access to sexual health care, which I think is particularly weird. It's a bit of a lacuna. There's only one prison service order which I could find in the course of my research of looking at this topic, which says that, you know, a GP in the prison can prescribe a condom if they think a particular prisoner is at risk of HIV or other sexually transmitted diseases. And I think this leads back to the point again about individual policies and how they may or may not be effective. I think from talking to Dr. Lamble, some prisons hand out condoms very openly, whilst others it's on request. And some prisons employ NHS services to come and have outreach clinics in order to treat prisoners or for the prisoners to receive medical advice about sexual health. So I think that there's a difficulty in relation to prisoners having the same level of access to sort of sexual health advice and treatment that they would otherwise do in the community. Prisoners are theoretically supposed to have the same access to treatment as anything which is available on the NHS, but we know that this often doesn't happen at all. And it's very unsurprising to people who practice prison law substantively that very many various reasonable requests are refused by prison healthcare. And that's sort of why we raised the issue of PrEP in the toolkit as well. PrEP is a widely now available drug on the NHS, which prevents against HIV transmission. And so we hope that prisoners who are advocating for themselves should be able to access that sort of treatment. I don't know how I'm doing for time. Very briefly, just talking about reporting sort of sexual abuse and homophobic violence to the police, or even transphobic abuse. 1 minute, okay. Thanks, Deborah. So LGBT plus prisoners, in my view, are at a risk of sexual abuse and homophobic or transphobic violence. I'll leave the issue of whether or not cis women prisoners are more of a risk from transgender prisoners for discussion later, and that's perhaps something that Dean can touch on. However, it's often the case that very little to nothing is done about allegations of sexual or violent assaults. And this could be done for a number of reasons. Firstly, prisoners are in custody. It mainly falls on prison staff and officials to collect evidence and information in relation to those allegations. There are difficulties sometimes securing the evidence. We know that CCTV is regularly not downloaded. We know that potential witnesses and suspects aren't spoken to. Secondly, that allegation has to be referred to the police for their investigation. Police officers, in my experience, routinely use the fact that someone's in prison or that the prison hasn't provided them with information as a result to either not investigate further or to discontinue an investigation into the allegation overall. So I think that creates a real difficulty for those who are subject to sexual or violent offences in prison. And I think that's why we've made sure that the toolkit has covered the steps that LGBT plus prisoners can take in order to make sure that both their rights under the Convention and their procedural rights are respected. I think I've probably gone a bit over time. I'll probably hand over to Dean to talk about how the transgender policy works in practice.
Thank you very much, Stuart. I have to say the guides and the toolkits produced are excellent, and it's really helpful even as practitioners to have a single one-stop document, particularly for transgender prisoners, and it's certainly one that I'll be encouraging all of my current clients to obtain copies of. I mean, in essence, the changes in the way in which the Secretary of State has treated transgender prisoners is a direct consequence of the Karen White case, and it's always the way in which the Secretary of State responds, and we've seen it in other areas such as the Joseph McCann and the error to release him. But before the Karen White case, the issue of risk assessment and trans prisoners was very much a local prison issue, and it was a real mixed bag. But what we know from the Karen White case is that her risk wasn't properly and thoroughly assessed before she was moved into the female estate. And as a result, a direct consequence of that, the Secretary of State set up the E-Wing unit at Downview. That came into fruition at around March 2019. And it wasn't until July 2019 that any actual policy was produced. So for a good period there, they were operating without any policy whatsoever. And it was sort of open season on how they were treating the residents there. They put 4 residents in there. I have heard rumours of a 5th resident, but it's not someone that I've come across. And at different points, I've represented the 4 females that were on the unit. The good news is that there's only 1 person left on the unit now. To put it into perspective, out of the 4, 3 had convictions of a sexual nature, and one didn't. All had their gender recognition certificates, but the policies only really came into fruition following the threat of legal proceedings. And it was those legal proceedings that led to the production of the policy. And the actual policy itself, the crux of it, is the E-Wing is designed for transgender women that hold gender recognition certificates who have been assessed or as presenting a high risk of harm to other women in custody or exhibiting behaviour that is dangerous, disruptive and or particularly challenging, and the risk cannot be safely managed on normal location within the women's estate. Now, what's interesting there is that that policy also enables the predicted risk, and it's that is often the problem, because the case board team often rely on psychology assessments around future risk as opposed to established behaviour. And I draw on Stuart's point there around the allegations, because it's often there's been an allegation of some sort made, and the issue then becomes how much weight they give to that, and how, generally that they treat it as being proven without any formal sanctions being imposed on the individual. So that's the sort of baseline test as to what qualifies a person to be on the unit. But of course, that's quite a high test, but in practice the bars appear to be quite low. And it's a point that I often make when I draft representations for the case board, in that the behaviours we're asking for, to be frank, many females in the female state have challenging and disruptive behaviour, and it's the question of what makes the behaviour so dangerous that they can't be residents on ordinary wings. Now, it's been quite an open season in terms of the Secretary of State's approach on the unit, and like I said at the very outset, there was no policy, so we were very much in the hands of the prison and threatening different legal actions. But one of the concerning points of the policy, which really frustrates me, is when they're looking to hold a complex case board, the disclosure, so the production of the material for us to take instructions on, in the policy is only to be disclosed 4 days before the actual case board sits. Now, for anyone out there who practices in prison law, they will know, generally, minus take away COVID out of the equation, it's difficult to get instructions from clients anyway. But with COVID into the mix, it becomes even harder. And it's testament to the way in which the Ministry of Justice are dealing with transgender prisoners, is in that the disclosure comes straight from the government legal department. I haven't had a single client in which I'm assisting where it's been made by PPCS or the MOJ. It comes direct from the government legal department. Just some sort of thoughts on my experience over the years of representing trans prisoners is, historically, the issue of someone embarking on the pathway has been confused with personality disorder. And it's taken quite some years for it to move on in that regard. But helpfully now, I think as it's become more openly discussed and more knowledgeable, that there's the risk of confusing the two is becoming more limited. But one of the things that strikes me with the case board, and sometimes this happens with the parole board as well, is the way in which medication is dealt with. So generally, those on E-Wing and most on the pathway are under the care of the gender clinics, and quite quickly, from my experience, they're prescribed medication, and that is normally an anti-androgen, which has the effects of blocking the testosterone. Now, the way in which the parole board and the case boards have dealt with that has been confused over the years, because there's been a failure to recognise the actual impact that medication has. And from my own practice, it's been one of the reasons why I've always relied on either good psychological evidence or psychiatric evidence. And I'll read out a section from a report that I had commissioned. Obviously, it won't name anybody and I won't say where it's from, but it's a good little passage to really put it into context. So it says, anti-androgen medication is a reliable means of reducing sexual interest and behaviour, and in consequence, sexual risk. Recidivism rates are reported to be less than 5% in sex offenders prescribed anti-androgens. There is no reason to believe that the physical and psychological effects should be any different in transgender individuals. And I read that out because certainly when I first started representing trans prisoners before the parole board, they were always viewed as for a lens of suspicion, and were they trying to pull the wool over the parole board's eyes, and how do we interpret risk assessments for trans prisoners? and it's through the use of the expert evidence that we seem to have moved on. And I can only say that because it's a small cross-section of the prison population, but having now represented around 10 prisoners in front of the Parole Board, it does seem as though they're starting to listen. But there's some obvious questions there. There's all different types of risk assessments out there for prisoners, but how do we apply those to trans prisoners? Do we use male assessments? Do we use female assessments? Is the underlying research applicable and relevant and can be applied? For me, it's an area that's under research, but it just strikes me that in the majority of areas of representing prisoners to the best of our ability, it comes down to good expert evidence, and for me, that's the real nub of it here. In terms of the Parole Board, I don't think the Parole Board have specifically identified a group of members that have good trans knowledge, but it does seem to be my own experience that we see the same Parole Board members dealing with trans cases, and I think that can only be a good thing, because it's taken quite some time to build up that to lessen the suspicion, and it's something that concerned me at the time. But going forward, how I would like to see it, I would like to see E-Wing close effectively, because we're down to one resident there now, and the regime is incredibly limited anyway, and at the moment it effectively amounts to solitary confinement. So I don't intend to say anything else on this. I'm sure there's lots of questions, and I think the time would be better spent answering the questions than listening to me moan about my experience. But the last word from me on this is the toolkits are a fundamental tool, not only for prisoners, but practitioners as well.
Thank you to all three of you. Very insightful and great work from all of you. Thank you. Thank you so much. So in terms of questions, we have a few that came through by email. So one from Ben Ellsworth from Mind, asking how do we know what impact the kits are having? And the answer is that feedback questionnaires were sent out with the kits to all prison libraries in England and Wales. Questionnaires are also going out with each kit that is sent to a prisoner, either at their request or upon the request of a caseworker. So that's in answer to Ben. We also have a question from Stephanie Stedman, a student at London Met University. How can we advocate for prisoners' mental health as COVID affects regime, staff morale and their rights? And another question from Pank Sethi from the Shannon Trust. What is being done to address the inequality between LGBTQ and other prisoners, and how violence towards them is largely ignored? We thought perhaps Dean could answer those questions.
So to answer the first question, the whole issue of mental health in the pandemic is a real live issue. To be completely frank, my view of the Ministry of Justice and our government is prisoners are viewed as the dregs of society, and I think that's best evidenced by the fact that post-COVID in March, it took quite some time for any prison policy to be produced on how to effectively safeguard prisoners. And mental health is an area that's often overlooked. I think it's hard to give a one broad brush answer on how to best help prisoners in this period, but I can say what we're doing, and that's where we've got concerns that the mental health assistance is falling below standard. We're serving pre-action protocol letters. And in relation to the second question, do you want to just remind me of the question, Deborah? Sorry, I went on such a spiel about the first question. I've lost the second one.
Okay, The second question, what is being done to address the inequality between LGBTQ and other prisoners, and how violence toward them is largely ignored?
Again, nationally, I don't think there is a lot happening at the moment, but that's across prisoners in the entire estate. The Prison Officers Association are saying one of the benefits of COVID is that the fact that the levels of violence are significantly reduced, and maybe the long-term solution is to have harsher regimes with people locked in their cell more. But I think in real terms, the way we can make differences is that when we're aware of an incident, we follow it up with legal action to ensure that it is properly investigated. My own experience of police liaison officers is mixed from prison to prison, but in cases where there's good prison liaison officers, often there is a good level of investigation undertaken into the incidents.
Thanks, Dean. Perhaps, Sarah, you might want to add a bit on the prisoner's perspective and the action they're taking.
Yeah, thanks. Just two things. I just wanted to come in on the COVID question, because I think one of the things is that we're often very stuck within a kind of limited framework for thinking about how we can deal with these problems. I mean, I think the ministry is stuck in a limited framework. And so other jurisdictions have responded to the COVID crisis by releasing people from prison, releasing people early, releasing people who are particularly vulnerable. And I think the mythology that everyone in prison is dangerous and therefore it would be harmful to release them is simply belied by the fact that people can be released and it doesn't create a danger to people. And so I think we need to be, I mean, having people locked up for 23 hours a day is just not acceptable. I think the COVID risks can't be managed properly within the prison estate. And so we should really be focusing on trying to get people out of prison, and we should be trying to focus on keeping people out of prison. And I think that requires a kind of push from across a range of different groups and organizations to really say, prisoners do matter. And we need to kind of push back on what Dean was saying about this kind of prisoners as being the kind of lowest of the low, and therefore not the kind of undeserving. And we have to push back on that. In terms of the question about, the violence and harm that prisoners face inside, I think one of the things that we hear a lot about at Bars is the incredible work that people do to try and keep each other safe. So groups, prisoners trying to start sort of self-help groups inside, organize events. So Bars has sometimes been invited by prisoners to come and speak at an event. And we see lots of people come to these events, and there's a real hunger for community and a kind of desire to look after each other. And I think we need to make sure that that becomes more possible, not less. And I think the kind of repressive regimes or the denial that there are, we've had some prisons say there aren't any LGBT prisoners in their prison, which is, just ridiculous. We know that's not the case. And so we need to really support the efforts of prisoners to get access to community, to be connected to people outside, because often people are safer if people know that there's someone out on the outside who's kind of keeping an eye on things and cares about them, and basically enable people to build up their supports and resources amongst each other and across the prison walls to help keep people safe. Because I think the evidence of the prison system tells us that we can try and bring in more policies to keep people safer from the system level, and that is important, but the things that often keep people safe are the kind of more horizontal, bottom-up things where people look after each other and look out for each other.
Thank you, Sarah, for that. We have two questions from Kate Lil from Paz, which will probably go to Dean and Stuart. The first one, some prisons have been refusing to conduct local and/or complex case boards for female transgender prisoners in the male estate due to the pandemic, stating that it is not safe to do so. As a result, transgender women continue to struggle with many issues, from being forced to live without items they need to live as a woman, to feeling fearful for their own safety because they have to shower when men are around. What can be done to resolve this issue when complaints are simply met with the COVID excuse? shall we start? Dean, do you want to start? And then we'll pass it on to Stuart. And they're quite long questions, so we'll come back to me and I'll read the next question.
Yeah, certainly. So the key for me is human rights and prisoner rights are not lost as a result of COVID. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier, that certainly from March up until June, we saw in the national news that the government hadn't got its head around care homes and residents, let alone prisoners and residents. And for me, it shows us how well it can be organised, because the Parole Board were very quickly able to start running remote hearings, whether by video link or telephone link. So the key question for me is, why can't a local board or a complex case board take place remotely? Within certain prison categories that I represent, for instance, there's CSC prisoners, so the prisoners within a prison, care and management plan meetings are still going ahead. I had one this morning. I participated remotely by telephone, so it can be done. Whether there's a will to do it or not is a different story, but that's where, again, I think we have to take a direct approach here and quite a hard line and say, well, if you're not going to, then here's a letter before claim setting out the rights that are in play here, and get the government legal department on board.
Yeah, I think I would totally agree with Dean on that. I think that the prison service should be taking practical steps to ensure that rights are practical and effective. I totally know from my experience, and Dean probably does a lot more than me in relation to Parole Board hearings, that are all done remotely. You can sign in from the comfort of your home. You know, the prisoners, obviously, prison, a number of other officials are zoomed in from around the country. I don't understand why they can't take place remotely. And obviously, if it's the case that there is a sort of policy, whether it's written or unwritten, that it's just because of COVID that they won't do these case review boards, then that's something that might be able to be challenged, especially if there's a real risk of prisoners' other rights being breached because of this practice or policy.
Thanks, Stuart. And the next question, which has been touched upon, but perhaps we can explore a bit further. Transgender women who are housed in the male estate and whose release is subject to review by the Parole Board can be refused release on the basis that they have not completed offender behaviour courses or interventions which are required to demonstrate the reduction in risk that is needed for release to be directed. However, appropriate courses for women don't appear to be offered in the male estate, and female-specific support that is often needed is also not available. This is a massive barrier to progression for these women. How can this be overcome? This is an excellent question. Perhaps, Dean, you can start off, and Stuart, if you have anything to add as well, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, the way I've always approached it is looking at what offender behaviour programmes had been completed up to that stage, and looking at the necessity as opposed to the benefits of completing offender behaviour programmes, because I'm preaching to the converted here in the sense that Parole Board panels, as much as it's not necessary to secure release to have completed programmes. By and large, parole panels look to the completion of offending behaviour programmes as reducing risk. But I think it goes back to the point I made earlier, that this is why it's so crucial to have good expert evidence. So, we know quite a lot of the time that when prison-based witnesses suggest programmes, they get the terminology confused on whether it's beneficial or necessary. And I think for me, it's always a starting point that I look at expert evidence to say, does this individual need this programme or not? Because especially with the new suites of programmes, Horizon and Kaizen, you can always make a decent argument to say they don't need it. But I think that's one of the very real issues that, in law, we treat trans prisoners with a gender recognition certificate as female, but because they're in the male estate, they're viewed as under their old persona, or those that are going through the process of getting their certificate are not able to access the programs. But of course, if we look at sex offending particularly, there's very limited sexual offending behaviour programmes for women anyway. It's often through one-to-one psychological work. So it's a real minefield, and that's the reason why I always stress the need to have good expert evidence.
Yeah, I mean, I just completely agree with Dean. Dean said everything and hit the nail on the head there.
I mean, just to add, sorry, Deborah. I mean, one of the things I think we also have to look at is some of those programs have had very poor reviews. And so, you know, there's a kind of tension on the one hand between trying to lobby for someone to get access to the programs, and then on the one hand, sometimes being critical of the results of those programs, especially some of the sex offender programs have had a lot of critical review. But, you know, as was mentioned, in the women's estate, often programming is done on a one-to-one basis. And so I think if someone is not being able to kind of progress for probation because they haven't had access to a group program, to me, there's no reason why they can't provide that program on a more one-to-one basis as they do often in other circumstances. So I think it's always important to look at, well, what are the barriers that are being put in place, and what adjustments can be made to make sure that people can meet the requirements that they have to meet in order to be released.
Thanks. We then have a question that Sarah can perhaps answer. Why do you think there's such a dearth of published material on the experiences of LGBT+ prisoners?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think there's a bunch of different reasons for it. I think on the one hand, historically, I think, historically, a lot of LGBT organizations like grassroots organizations did a lot of work with prisoners, especially because of the criminalization of LGBT people. But I think in the last few decades, as we've seen, you know, some more mainstream, well-funded, and I would say white-dominated LGBT organizations have tended to stop thinking about prisoners as part of the LGBT community. And so they get missed within kind of mainstream LGBT organizations. And then on the other hand, I think historically prisoner support organizations have not always considered the needs and issues of LGBT people on that side of the issue. And so you kind of get this gap where LGBT people's needs in prison fall through the cracks. And so one of the things that it's really great of why that PAS has done these toolkits is because I think it's trying to we're trying to bring those issues together, and hopefully we will see greater attention across you know, LGBT organizations and prisoner support organizations to really focus on the needs and issues of LGBT people who are criminalized.
Thank you, Sarah. And we have a question from Letty Davis about how the booklets will be distributed. The kits have been sent out to libraries in all prisons in England and Wales. Prisoners can also request the kits directly from PAS or Bent Bars. Sarah pointed out that one of the questions that was asked to prisoners in their survey was whether they would have liked them to be distributed by prison officers, and prisoners clearly indicated that they would have preferred not to, and it was not a good or safe idea. So we are distributing them via libraries and through our organizations instead. We then have a question for Dean from Tara Mulcair. If E-wing were closed, where is best for the small group of high-risk trans women prisoners to be accommodated? To you, Dean.
Well, 3 of the 4 so far have been moved to ordinary location within the female state. So my own view, knowing the one that's left there, is normal female location. I mean, let's not forget that the policy that I read out around being particularly dangerous or challenging equally applies to the categorisation within the female state of a restricted status prisoner. So there is the option of the Secretary of State to make prisoners restricted status. Now, I'm not advocating that that should be the case, but it seems that the two are largely comparable. So it's an option, but I don't think that keeping the unit going with one single resident, in effect in solitary confinement, asking for evidence of risk reduction, but not effectively enabling a means to provide that evidence of risk reduction, is appropriate.
Thank you for that, Dean. We have a couple of questions from Robin Emerton. Apart from the emphasis on risk assessment, establishment of the E-wing at Downview, has the new, much more restrictive 2019 policy on transgender prisoners had any other negative effects on how transgender people are treated on their daily lives in prison? Perhaps, Dean, do you want to start on that? And I'm not sure whether Sarah or Stuart might want to add their comments afterwards.
I think it's a mixed picture. I mean, I can only speak from experience of how clients raise concerns with me, and the focus of the concerns that I've been dealing with relate to E-wing and the way in which that's been operating. But I think for trans prisoners in the female estate, I think there is a sort of a consensus that the rules are not necessarily operating fairly and in a non-discriminatory way.
Just to add, I mean, I do think there were, in the new policy, there were some, a few things that were improvements. So around the procedures of the case boards, people are now entitled to access to those documents. People are entitled to request, I mean, they're not entitled to have, but to request a Mackenzie friend to be there to support them through the process. There's explicit directions around, you know, prison officers are expected to respect people's gender identities, regardless of whether, you know, where they're placed in the prison system. So I think there were some small gains, but I think on the whole, the policy really shifted its emphasis to risk management, where previous policies were kind of, you know, did talk about the language of balancing needs and risks, but I think this one is really overemphasized risk. And I think we've also seen this, I mean, this is partly, I think, a result of the media constructing, and your work, Robin, on this, I think is also very important in terms of constructing trans people and trans bodies as inherently risky. And I think that's been, you know, and the relentless association of trans people with sex offending and danger, I think that has been pushed by the media in a really harmful way that associates this kind of notion of risk. You know, the previous policy was brought in because trans women died in prison. And it's like we've lost sight of the harms that trans people face because of this kind of rebranding of trans people as a risk factor. And I think we really need to push back on that. And I'll just briefly mention that you know, at Bent Bars, we're just about to release some information sheets about trans prisoners. Hopefully later this week, they'll be ready with the launch of our new website, or, you know, check back at the end of the month. But we're really trying to provide some information, you know, accurate information that can kind of contest some of the widely misinformed and the kind of misuse of, you know, particular examples that are then being used to demonize all trans people and trans prisoners, and wildly inaccurate ideas about trans prisoners. And I think we need to push back on that because it's really distorting public perception about the issues that and the vulnerabilities that not just trans people face, but LGBT people and all people in prison face.
We are running out of time. We have another 3 questions. Perhaps we could quickly address them. One of them relates to issues around transgender people being able to access gender recognition certificates. I think Sarah, you might want to answer that.
Sure. Just in terms of, I mean, we know that there's massive gatekeeping that happens within the prison. And so People can't even get referrals to the gender, clinics. And there's this kind of catch-22 that people have to be living in their gender for 2 years under the Gender Recognition Act in order to get a GRC. But often, if you're held in the prison that doesn't match your gender identity, then it's very difficult to prove that you've been living in that gender. And so prisoners are really in a catch-22. And I know, again, the media tries to suggest that people just declare that they're trans and then they practically get moved and they get a GRC right away. And that's simply not true. We don't know the exact numbers, but it's expected to be extremely small, the number of trans prisoners that actually have a GRC. And I think those barriers are partly about the prison, and I also think they're partly about limits in the Gender Recognition Act.
And also that you have to compare some of what happens in the community, where a lot of trans people don't necessarily want a GRC, or think that it's sort of an archaic institution that they have to be assessed by a panel of experts or judicial members to say that now you can have your gender. A lot of people in the community don't care about that, but where it's obviously a very heightened issue in prison, because you need that GRC in order to go to the relevant estate.
The questions keep flooding in, but I'm not sure we'll have the time to answer these. So we will aim to answer these by message, perhaps. And I'm going to thank our speakers for participating at this launch. It's been a really great exchange of issues that are so pertinent to trans and LGBT prisoners. I'll pass the virtual floor to Lubia now, and I'll thank you again for your participation.
Thank you, Deborah. Very quickly, thank you again to all of the writers and contributors of the toolkit. I do have a slightly warm, fuzzy feeling, thinking the amount of goodwill that's present from all the people that have been involved in this gives me a nice warm fuzzy feeling. Thank you very much, and we need those warm fuzzy feelings. Thank you to our funders, thank you to the trustees and the amazing volunteers who, even through the pandemic, have continued to support us in our work. A special thank you to our staff who have just carried on working as if there was no pandemic. Well done, you guys. Thank you to the panel, and thank you to Cooley again for hosting this for us. Hopefully it doesn't become the norm and we can actually sort of see people in the flesh, fully dressed, of course, but that would be great. Thank you again, everybody, and thank you, Cooley. Enjoy the rest of your evening.